The arts and crafts movement was a reaction from a collective of artists and critics against the increasing dominance of industrial machine production in the 19th century. Inspired by an idealized vision of medieval craftsmanship, they insisted on the unique value of the handcrafts as opposed to machinery, and hoped that by demonstrating the superiority of the crafts, they would persuade social and economic reform. By the end of the 19th century, the movement's ideals had influenced mainstream culture and inspired a commercial trend among the upper middle classes for all things handmade, prompting a renewal of the traditional trades, with 130 arts and crafts organisations formed in Britain between 1895 and 1905. The movement later travelled across to the United States and even to Japan, where it contributed to a brief revival of traditional Japanese folk art in the 1920s. The origins of the arts and crafts movement are varied and intricate, but most would agree that its philosophy and ethics were derived in large measure from John Ruskin's social criticism. Ruskin was one of the most influential and prolific figures of the Victorian era. He was born in London in 1819 to a wealthy family owing to his father's success as a sherry and wine importer. During his childhood, the family travelled widely across Britain and Europe, including a tour across France and northern Italy in 1833, when Ruskin was 14. In 1835, he visited Venice for the first time and developed a lifelong love affair with the city, as well as a passion for the study of history, art and architecture. He returned to Venice twice during the winters of 1849-50 and 1851-52 with his wife. During these visits, his wife apparently spent her time having an affair with an Austrian soldier. Meanwhile, Ruskin was busy drawing extensive sketches of the nearby architecture, especially the great Gothic buildings, such as the St. Mark's Basilica and the Ducal Palace. He later compiled these drawings into a comprehensive account of the city's architecture, which was published between 1851 and 1853 as a 3-volume treatise titled The Stones of Venice. The underlying premise in these volumes is the assertion that architecture offers insight into history, that the history of Venice, as well as every other city, could be observed simply by examining the buildings and noting the contrast in style and quality across different time periods. Through this exercise, Ruskin observed evidence of Venice's cultural decline by comparing the architecture of the early medieval period to the Renaissance. The first he favoured for its spontaneity and honesty, which he associated with what he viewed as an age of Christian piety, whereas the latter he found disagreeable for its inhumane and mathematical precision, and believed to be the work of a decadent society corrupted by religious unbelief and self-indulgence. In the first chapter of the first volume of The Stones of Venice, Ruskin writes, "Now Venice, as she was once the most religious, was in her fall the most corrupt of European states. And as she was in her strength, the centre of the pure currents of Christian architecture, so she is in her decline the source of the Renaissance. It was the originality and splendour of the palaces of Vicenza and Venice which gave this school its eminence in the eyes of Europe, and the dying city, magnificent in her dissipation and graceful in her follies, obtained wider worship in her decrepitude than in her youth, and sank from the midst of her admirers into the grave." Ruskin thus regarded the history of civilization as being intertwined with religion, and sympathized with the idea, common amongst historians at the time, that the rise and fall of a nation correlates with the piety and moral character of its people. In this way, Ruskin attributes aesthetics to morality, concluding that art, and in particular architecture, mirrors the spiritual condition and health of society. However, if this is true, what did the Victorian style say about the moral and spiritual state of Britain in the 19th century? This was the question that Ruskin sought to answer in his famous chapter titled The Nature of the Gothic. According to Ruskin, the ugliness produced by industrial Britain reflected the moral decadence of a society and economic system that impoverished and exploited the working classes. Poverty involves more than the lack of money. What was equally disagreeable to Ruskin was cultural poverty, which not least involved the torment caused by the lack of fulfillment and the stifling of creativity that he believed were the consequences of automation and mass production. He writes, "It is not that men are ill-fed, but that they have no pleasure in the work by which they make their bread, and therefore look to wealth as the only means of pleasure. In order to adapt to the division of labour in any factory, the worker must subdue himself and be degraded to an unthinking mechanism, endlessly repeating a single task and exercising a single set of faculties, devoid of individuality and inspiration. As Ruskin eloquently states, it is not, truly speaking, the labour that is divided, but the men, divided into mere segments of men, broken into small fragments and crumbs of life, so that all the little pieces of intelligence that is left in a man is not enough to make a pin or a nail, but exhausts itself in making the point of a pin or the head of a nail. On the other hand, the medieval system, in his view, recognized the value of the individual as being a unique creation of God, and for this reason allowed each man the freedom to enjoy creative and personal expression in his work, as well as the satisfaction in being fully involved from start to finish. Seldom does the industrial worker get to experience any of these pleasures. This then was Ruskin's explanation for the beauty of the Gothic style, that it was the result of the liberty and therefore happiness of the medieval workman, whereas the ugliness of industry the result of constraint and drudgery. So far, Ruskin had only diagnosed the problem, but between August and November 1860, he published 4 essays in the Cornhill magazine that sought to outline his solution. However, Ruskin's unorthodox and dissenting opinions on economics were greeted with an outcry of protest from the magazine's largely conservative readership, forcing Cornhill's editor, William Thackeray, to abandon the series entirely. In essence, the essays were an appeal to the magnates and industrialists of the Victorian era to adopt a social conscience, explaining that an economy based on cooperation, fairness, and morality, rather than just profit, would benefit not only society at large, but in the long run would be good for business as well. In the 3rd essay, he summarizes this argument in a single quote from his 1842 book titled Modern Painters. Government and cooperation are in all things and eternally the laws of life. Anarchy and competition, eternally and in all things, the laws of death. Despite the controversy around Ruskin and his dwindling readership, his former assistant turned publisher, George Allen, convinced him to compile the essays into a book, which was published in 1862 with the title, Unto This Last, 4 Essays on the Principles of Political Economy. At first, the reception remained much the same as before, and thousands of copies went unsold. But by the end of the century, it had gradually become a major success and one of Ruskin's most celebrated works. In his autobiography, Mahatma Gandhi, who read Unto This Last in 1903 while travelling across South Africa, claimed that the book had completely transformed him. He writes, "It was Ruskin's Unto This Last. The book was impossible to lay aside once I had begun it. It gripped me. Johannesburg to Durban was a 24-hour journey. The train reached there in the evening. I could not get any sleep that night. I determined to change my life in accordance with the ideals of the book." The essays were also praised by the economist John A. Hobson and cited as an inspiration upon the founders of the British Labour Party. In 1906, the famous journalist William Thomas Stead sent the first Labour MPs recently elected to the House of Commons a questionnaire about their political influences. Ruskin was mentioned more times than anyone else, more indeed than the Bible itself, and 9 of the 17 mentioned Unto This Last in particular. But aside from political figures, Ruskin also influenced a new generation of artists, the most famous of which was the poet and textile designer William Morris, who was one of the first to absorb Ruskinian values into his artwork and business, and in doing so, arguably led the way for the emergence of what became known as the arts and crafts movement. Morris was born in Walthamstow, Essex, to a wealthy middle-class family. In 1853, he entered Oxford University, where he came under the influence of the medievalist movement, a form of romanticism that opposed many of the values of Victorian industrial capitalism. As a student and continuing throughout his life, he believed in an idealized image of the Middle Ages as an era characterized by strong chivalric values and an organic pre-capitalist sense of community. This attitude was compounded by his reading of Thomas Carlyle's book, Past and Present, in which Carlyle championed medieval values as a potential remedy for the problems of Victorian society. It was Ruskin, though, who would become the foremost influence on Morris's life. Reading Ruskin's works, including Modern Painters, The Seven Lamps of Architecture, and The Stones of Venice, not only strengthened his convictions even more, but also provided him with a sense of purpose and determination. Fellow Oxford undergraduate Richard W. Dixon claimed that whilst in the company of friends, Morris would often read Ruskin aloud. He had a mighty singing voice, enchanted rather than read those weltering oceans of eloquence as they have never been given before or since. In a lecture he delivered in 1881 titled The Prospects of Architecture in Civilization, Morris asserted that Ruskin's chapter, The Nature of the Gothic, should have been posted up in every school of art throughout the country, nay in every association of English-speaking people which professes in any way to further the culture of mankind. A decade later, in January 1891, soon after he started the Kelmscott Press, Morris published The Nature of the Gothic as a book, and wrote in the preface that Ruskin's chapter was one of the very few necessary and inevitable utterances of the century. To some of us when we first read it, now many years ago, it seemed to point out a new road on which the world should travel. After university, Morris set out to travel on this new road and bring physical expression to Ruskin's ideas. The journey began in 1859 when Morris, desiring a new home for his new family, committed much of his fortune into the construction of what became known as the Red House, so called because of the distinctive red colour of the bricks. He chose for the building to be located in the Kentish hamlet of Upton, near Beckley Heath, 10 miles from central London, and commissioned his close friend and fellow Oxford undergraduate, Philip Webb, to design the architecture. In keeping with their ideals, most of the furnishings and decorations were designed and handmade by either Morris or Webb, including the oak furniture, the wallpaper, the embroidery, the glass tableware, and the stained glass windows. Both men thus demonstrated an aptitude for quickly learning and acquiring new skills and materials. The results of their workmanship represented the first instance of Ruskin's ideals being put into practice, and therefore signalled the beginning of the arts and crafts movement. For Morris personally, the joy he experienced in furnishing the Red House revealed to him that his true vocation was in the decorative arts. Therefore, in April 1861, Morris established a decorative arts company along with 6 other partners. The founders of the company simply referred to themselves as the firm, and their purpose above all was to make beautiful objects based on skilled craftsmanship. In doing so, they hoped to revive decoration as one of the fine arts, while informing the taste of the general public away from mass-produced goods. Although associated with the neo-Gothic design movement, which typically just incorporated Gothic elements into contemporary buildings, they were more radical in their approach and sought to fully embody Ruskin's message by returning as much as possible to the medieval system and methods of craftsmanship. Most of the products created by the firm had existed during the medieval age, including woven textiles, tapestry, carpets, embroidery and stained glass. Others were more modern, such as wallpaper design and printed textiles. Their stained glass windows were an early success, thanks to commissions from the architect George Frederick Bodley, who incorporated the glasswork in several of his neo-Gothic churches, including St. Michael's Church in Brighton, All Saints' Church in Selsley, and Jesus Chapel in Cambridge. Following this, 2 commissions in particular would cement the firm's reputation as one of the leading design companies of the late 19th century. A royal project commissioned by the Prince of Wales at St. James's Palace, and the Green Dining Room project at the South Kensington Museum, now known as the Victoria and Albert Museum. The characteristic wallpaper and fabric designs for which the firm was and is now best known date from the 1870s and were a huge commercial success among the upper middle class and wealthy consumers in England. In drawing the patterns and colouring the designs, Morris displayed his true genius more than in any other of his countless endeavours. His style is instantly recognisable, full of vibrancy, affection and natural colour, and springs directly from his wistful romanticism. Despite this success, Morris became steadily frustrated that his art and his business were not having the intended effect of inspiring social change. With all the commissions from aristocrats and wealthy industrialists, It seemed to him that he was merely ministering to the swinish luxury of the rich, as he put it. Gradually he realized that the fulfillment of Ruskin's ideals, his main goal from the very beginning, was not possible in the existing economic system. That regardless of how well-intentioned the individual or the business may be, ultimately they will be poisoned by the thorns of capitalism. Clearly at some point in the 1870s or late 1860s, Morris had discarded Ruskin and traded him for the famous revolutionary socialist Karl Marx. In October 1885, Morris wrote a letter to Fred Pickles, a member of the Bradford branch of the Socialist League, in which he criticized his former hero Ruskin using explicitly Marxist terms. Ruskin is quite sound in his condemnation of rent and usury, but he does not understand this matter of classes. The class struggle is really the only lever for bringing about the change. Morris would always share Ruskin's nostalgia for the medieval era, but Marx had convinced Morris that real change would not happen by longing for a distant past. It would only happen by looking ahead, by envisioning a progressive and utopian future. Therefore, towards the end of his career in the 1880s, Morris set aside his artwork and for the rest of his life dedicated his efforts entirely to politics and the advancement of socialism.